I want you to imagine a scene with me. Go ahead and close your eyes. It's a beautiful early summer day on a tranquil Hawaiian beach. The sand is warm beneath your feet. The faint sounds of a distant bird lull you into a state of pure and undeniable bliss. After a moment, you become aware of something approaching you from the distance along the shore. As you squint your eyes, you realize that what's approaching you is a person, and actually, it's not just one person, it's two. They don't speak to you, but somehow you know that these two beings, these two heavenly beings on this Hawaiian beach, are about to make your wildest dreams come true. So as you probably guessed, those two heavenly beings are actually Steven Spielberg and George Lucas circa 1977. And together they're about to invent Indiana Jones. The story goes that Steven and George, who were and remain to this day the very best of friends, took a Hawaiian vacation together right after George finished production on the original Star Wars movie. And for the first few days of that vacation, it sounds like George was kind of a massive downer. But put yourself in George's shoes. He had just wrapped an insane shoot that went severely over budget and literally almost killed him, all for a science fiction movie that nobody really believed in anyway.
Didn't think it was going to be any good. At least I didn't. I thought, this is a bit strange.
So in other words, a tropical vacation with his friend Steven probably sounded like the best possible place to avoid the fallout of what would surely be the last movie he would ever be allowed to make. But you might be surprised to hear that Star Wars was not the last movie that George Lucas was allowed to make. And it was on that vacation that he learned it might actually be a success after all.
And George at that point just, I think, gushed a sigh of relief. And then changed the subject from Star Wars to what I was doing next. And I said, well, you know what? I've always wanted to direct a James Bond picture. And George said, I got that beat. I said, what do you mean? He said, I have a better idea.
And so they spent the next few days as the two most bankable directors in Hollywood, just kind of building sandcastles on the shores of Hawaii and brainstorming what would ultimately become their very first professional collaboration, a movie called Raiders of the Lost Ark. Starring Harrison Ford, hot off his breakthrough role as Han Solo in Star Wars, the movie was directed by Spielberg with a heavy creative influence, including a story by credit from George Lucas. Popular reviews were glowing, and according to thenumbers.com, Raiders remains, to this day, the leggiest film ever made. Which, hey, that's a fun name for a category. Arthur Knight concluded his Hollywood Reporter review of the film by saying, "Lucas and Spielberg have just opened up another gold mine." But I actually think that that's kind of a misleading metaphor, because as anyone who has ever achieved any kind of success will tell you, replicating it isn't so much like returning to a gold mine. It's more similar to trying to get lightning to strike in the same place twice. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. All of the little missteps that they took with Indiana Jones over the years, trying to get that lightning to strike again. The weird unmade screenplays when they were trying to figure out what makes Indiana Jones, like the one where a gorilla steals his clothes and they go to a magic peach garden. That's a good one. And the fact that there is an entire Indiana Jones TV show that Harrison Ford himself appeared on that no one ever really seems to talk about. Because, I mean, this thing is wild. It revolutionized global media production by shooting all over the world, taught us way more about Indiana Jones as a human being than we probably ever wanted to know.
I've never been fond of cats, now I hate them.
And ultimately, it had a much bigger impact on the franchise than I think anyone ever gives it credit for. But before all of that, George and Steven found themselves faced with this challenge in 1981. How do you make a sequel to a movie like Raiders of the Lost Ark?
When George and I were in Hawaii and I agreed to direct Raiders, George said that if I did wind up directing the first one, that I would need to direct 3 of them. He said he had 3 stories in mind. It turned out George did not have 3 stories in mind. We had to make up all the other subsequent stories. So it was like 2 weeks after Raiders opened that we knew we were going to have to sit down in a room and figure out what Raiders 2 is going to be.
And I think that's actually a harder question to answer than you might think. I mean, things are wrapped up pretty neatly at the end of that movie. There are not exactly a ton of plot threads left dangling that absolutely needed to be resolved or continued. There's not even a surviving villain. Like at the end of Star Wars, Darth Vader gets away, threatening to return again sometime and get his revenge. But that definitely does not happen in Raiders. A lot of what ultimately became Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was recycled from ideas that had been brainstormed for the original Raiders of the Lost Ark, including an escape from an airplane with an inflatable raft, and a minecart chase, which had both been pitched and scrapped the previous time. But even though the second Indiana Jones movie shares some creative DNA with its predecessor, it really does a lot more differently. Temple of Doom was released in May of 1984 to mixed contemporary reviews. In retrospect, it's pretty easy to see Temple of Doom as the black sheep of the original trilogy, without the cartoonish Nazis for Indy to face off against, or fan favorite side characters like Sala and Marcus Brody. It's also undeniably darker in tone, like much darker. Aside from Indiana Jones himself and a few subtle callbacks, there's not really too much connective tissue to Raiders of the Lost Ark at all. But the thing is, that was not an accident. George Lucas's original intention for the franchise was actually to do something completely different every time, even explore different genres instead of sticking to any kind of formula. I actually like Temple of Doom a lot, and I think it's definitely seen in a slightly more positive light these days, because it did try to do something different.
Nice try, Lao She!
But back when it was first released, people were not into that at all. And there kind of are two different directions that you can go there, right? You can go back to basics the third time, or you can take a different big swing and kind of embrace the idea that these movies are all gonna kind of do their own thing. In preparation for a third film, Lucas wrote another story treatment that was adapted into a screenplay by Chris Columbus in 1985. This script for Indiana Jones 3 opens with Indy investigating mysterious murders in a haunted castle in Scotland. And right off the bat, this was obviously another stark departure for the Indiana Jones franchise. But again, it kind of sounds like George Lucas wanted this to be a franchise of stark departures. The first film explored the supernatural powers of a Judeo-Christian artifact in the Middle East. The second, a cult based around a twisted version of Hinduism. So honestly, a haunted European castle does kind of make sense as the third beat in that sequence. Eventually, he and a new set of companions would travel to Africa to meet a 200-year-old jungle prince named Taiki. What followed was going to be a quest to find a lost city, along with some confrontations with a brand new cast of Nazi villains, including one with a mechanical arm. This script has some compelling concepts, but it really collapses in on itself at the climax when let me see if I have this right. Indiana Jones is killed by a Nazi and then resurrected by a heavenly peach. What? Lucas and Spielberg realized that the script was way too unrealistic, even for an Indiana Jones film, and they opted, ultimately, to go back to basics for Indy's third theatrical outing, especially after sitting with popular reviews of Temple of Doom, which were pretty critical of the new direction. And that kind of leaves Temple of Doom high and dry as the one weird one of the trilogy. Also, the Austrian castle setting that's used about halfway through The Last Crusade is a little remnant from that earlier draft of the story. And so is that scene where a bunch of students are mobbing Indy's office. But if you ever get the idea that Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade kind of stagnates in terms of expanding the franchise, and just look at this side by side, it's actually kind of insane how shot for shot some of this stuff is. It does delve into Indiana Jones the character much more than the previous two movies did. Like especially his backstory and his relationship with his father.
Did I ever tell you to eat up, go to bed, wash your ears, do your homework? No, I respected your privacy, and I taught you self-reliance.
What you taught me was that I was less important to you than people who'd been dead for 500 years in another country.
When developing the character originally, Lucas and Spielberg actually made a conscious choice to not worry about laying out any kind of concrete backstory, and instead focused on fleshing out Indy's lifestyle as an adult. But eventually those kinds of questions started to pop up.
In the process of making the Indiana Jones films, I kept thinking about what was Indiana Jones like as a young man, because Harrison would ask me, Steve would ask me, everybody was sort of curious about how this adventurer grew up.
They chose to answer some of them in a formula-breaking prologue with a younger version of the character played by River Phoenix. This sequence was generally well received, and for the first time showed George Lucas one potential way to continue the Indiana Jones franchise beyond the movies. And so he used that scene as a kind of retroactive backdoor pilot for the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, a live-action TV series that premiered on March 4th, 1992, without the involvement of either Steven Spielberg or Harrison Ford. And while River Phoenix had stepped into the role for The Last Crusade's prologue, fully recasting such an iconic character would prove to be no easy task. Luckily, the nature of the series allowed George Lucas the freedom from trying to find just one actor who could live up to Ford's impossibly charismatic performance. Instead, he was able to delegate the role to 3. And one of those 3 actors actually got to do something that no one has ever done before or since. He got to play Indiana Jones in stories that were set in the present day. Apologies, by the way, that some of this footage is kind of rough. I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. Each episode of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles is bookended by scenes set in what was then modern-day New York City. In these scenes, we're introduced to a 93-year-old version of Indiana Jones, played by a Canadian actor named George Hall. Something, or someone, spurs a memory in him, and he recalls a story from his childhood, which then makes up the bulk of the episode via flashbacks.
I was reminded of something from my youth.
It's definitely a little jarring at first to see a character like Indiana Jones, who's so associated with the more distant past, doing things in a time period like the 1990s.
I want your blood.
And what's especially interesting about these old Indiana Jones segments are the things that they decided to make up about his life and family. Because he's in, like 30 episodes. So that was a lot of mythology that they had to come up with. Most of which has been either passively ignored or directly contradicted by the later movies. These scenes were obviously produced many years before Indy and Marion were shown reconnecting and marrying in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Despite the fact that Harrison Ford is now actually older in real life than George Hall was during the filming of any of these segments, there are, canonically, still about 20 years between their reconciliation in the final scene of Dial of Destiny and any of the scenes with old Indy in the TV show. So it would technically be possible for her to have passed away in the intervening years. Speaking of which, there's also obviously no mention of Shia LaBeouf's Mutt Williams character, who is pretty heavily implied to be Indy's only child in those later 2 movies. Instead, old Indy references the fact that he has multiple living children in one episode.
The upshot of was that my children are questioning my ability to look after myself.
We also see a daughter named Sophie in a couple episodes, and we're made aware of at least 3 of his grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren.
I was just a little bit older than you are now.
That must have been a long time ago.
In the series, the old Indiana Jones is seen doing things like skulking around the Museum of Natural History and giving a lecture to what he believes to be the Pennsylvania Historical Society.
Your audience is waiting across the hall in lecture room 103.
My audience?
It's the Pennsylvania History Society. This is the American Congress of Neurology.
But it's not like he's always pursuing what you would describe as strictly scholarly pursuits. There was that time he accidentally dropped a hamburger into a mailbox and ended up telling a stranger about when he used to be a spy.
Spy? You mean like James Bond?
But despite the fact that we can all agree that senile Indy is an absolute treasure,
I'm sorry I ever met you.
I have that effect on people.
Ultimately, these scenes set in the early 1990s are nothing more than quirky and occasionally charming framing devices. The majority of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles does just that. It chronicles the life of young Indiana Jones. And the series actually tells stories in 2 different periods of his youth. Corey Carrier plays the character in stories that are set between 1908 and 1910, as Indy accompanies Henry Sr. on a lecture tour.
That was an interesting speech, Junior.
Thank you, Father.
Now, eat your tripe.
While Sean Patrick Flannery plays the character in stories that are set during World War I and beyond.
Dear Dad, I've joined the Mexican Revolution. Sorry about high school.
I knew I was looking for somebody idealistic and naive, because the whole point of the show is that he's sort of facing all these adventures, and this is what turns him into sort of the world-weary cynic that he becomes later on.
The original plan for the series was to alternate between the two actors week to week, but the show pretty quickly started favoring the young adult version of the character, who is the focus in 25 of the 32 total installments. And that was also probably like a, child labor law decision as well.
By the time this is finished, you'll have a good picture of his life from the age of 5 to 20, and then from 35 to 40, and then from 90 to 95. So you'll have these little bits of his life that will have been documented.
Development of the series started with George just locking himself into a room for a couple of weeks and mapping out Indiana Jones's entire fictional backstory. Basically everything that ever happened to him between 1908 and 1922. He then passed that material onto a small writing staff who turned it into stories and then eventually scripts for about 70 episodes, each centered around a historical event, exotic location, or figure in history that Indy could cross paths with. And that's another thing that helps the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles stand apart from the rest of the franchise. While references to historical events and people had been sprinkled in throughout the movies,
This new Hachi's a real small guy.
the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles was designed to be much more grounded in historical reality. In talking about the series, George Lucas said, "I have an educational foundation working with interactive projects, and I got this idea to get kids involved in history through the Young Indiana Jones character." The educational foundation that he's referring to was founded in 1991 with the express goal of improving K-12 education in America.
Early on in the life of the foundation, George said, "A lot of people know education ought to be different, but they don't know in what way."
Saying that it needs to be better is very, very easy. The how is very, very hard.
And realizing that with his unique filmography, he could contribute more than just his time and money to that cause, Lucas conceptualized the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles as something that was just as educational as it was entertaining. But to be clear, it's not like the show is a series of history lessons. There are frequent exaggerations of historical events and people for dramatic effect.
But I want to see Roosevelt. He's the best. A president, a boxer, and a hunter.
Along with plenty of action sequences, especially in the Sean Patrick Flannery episodes. It feels more like the goal was to introduce young audiences to some of the major moments in recent history, not to bore them with a lengthy history lesson.
I am a great lover of history, and I think it's very important for young people to understand the humanities, of which history is a major part. I think if young people see that people who have accomplished a lot are not that much different from the way they are, it gives them a little bit more freedom to think outside the box and to think that they can do great things.
The other advantage was that they had kind of already shown that Indiana Jones was sort of a massive nerd. He was an archaeology professor. He was proficient in several foreign languages and knowledgeable about a variety of different subjects.
Mid-12th century, I should think.
That was our assessment as well.
It was very much in keeping with the spirit of that character to show the experiences that made him that way. And the series is very much structured that way. Each episode depicts young Indy in a new country or witnessing a historic event. This is the episode where he meets Winston Churchill, for example, or this is the one where he goes to China.
Faster! Faster!
Sweetheart, no. Think of the poor rickshaw man.
And really, every single episode is like a mini movie, with incredible production value, numerous guest stars, and on-location shooting basically all over the world. They each cost about $1.5 million to produce, and featured some surprisingly impressive behind-the-scenes talent. Some of the notable writers or co-writers were Jonathan Hales, who actually went on to co-write Attack of the Clones with George Lucas, Star Wars sound designer and editor Ben Burtt, and actually even Carrie Fisher, whose writing career had taken off after she had adapted her acclaimed novel Postcards from the Edge into a screenplay in 1990. Another of the series writers, who also directed a handful of episodes, was Frank Darabont.
We're called in from all parts of the world to meet with George, who has a master list of events and story ideas.
Does Indy actually get to sit down and talk to him? Or does he see him from a distance?
We do one story a day, which is very intense over 3 weeks, and there's a little bit of the syndrome of, if it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium.
It can get loud, it can get excited, you know, because you've got writers in there. It can get kind of passionate, of course, but it's all to the good. It's all, you know, aimed at creating the best show that we can.
In addition to writers and directors, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles is absolutely stacked to the brim with notable guest stars. There are episodes featuring people like Daniel Craig, Elizabeth Hurley, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Paul Freeman, Ian McDiarmid, Max von Sydow, Anthony Daniels, and Christopher Lee. Apparently, they also offered Clint Eastwood $10 million to play Indiana Jones's never-again-referenced older brother. I've seen some people say that this character's name was going to be Illinois Jones, which, I don't know, I think that might have been a little too on the nose, don't you think? There are also some other friendly faces that pop up from time to time. Actors who aren't necessarily big stars in and of themselves, but who you might recognize from other Lucasfilm projects of the past and future. Because of its ambitious production and scope, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles wasn't produced in the traditional TV format of one episode at a time. Instead, the series was shot on location in a continuous production block, much more like a feature film than a traditional TV series. The first production block, shot over several months in 1991 and 1992, produced 17 TV hours worth of material. 2 of those hours combined to make the series premiere, a pilot episode titled Young Indiana Jones and the Curse of the Jackal. Because it was a 2-part TV movie, this pilot episode is one of the few episodes in the series to actually feature both Corey Carrier and Sean Patrick Flannery stories, in order to introduce audiences to the 2 separate time periods that would be featured in the show going forward.
8 years later, I was in Mexico.
What does Mexico have to do with it?
Listen, kid, who's telling this story, you or me?
You, sir.
Damn right, so shut up and listen.
This pilot episode received largely positive reviews from critics, although some audience members were disappointed by the lack of action, something that was obviously a defining characteristic of the main series of movies. After the pilot episode, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles aired weekly on ABC for the next 5 weeks, before being put on a summer hiatus due to dwindling ratings. 4 more episodes were aired in the next TV season, starting in September. Those 4 episodes, in addition to the truncated first season, accounted for only 11 of the 17 hours of material that had already been shot by that point. The show was still underperforming though, and ABC decided to put it on another sudden hiatus following an episode set in Barcelona. In an interview with Starlog magazine, George Lucas said, "I'm fairly confident that ABC will play the majority of them. If they don't, obviously I want to continue on with them." But the relatively high cost of the series, combined with its less than impressive ratings, put the show in serious jeopardy despite the critical acclaim. Brian Lowry of Variety wrote that, "In short, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles is lavishly produced, ranks among the best hours on TV, and still seems doomed to virtually certain commercial failure." In one final attempt to get people on board with the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, ABC relaunched the show in March of 1993, and they did so by advertising a very special episode.
It's Harrison Ford in a world premiere Indiana Jones movie.
Not my first time, you know.
One of your favorite heroes.
Indiana Jones.
In an all-new adventure. Harrison Ford brings you Young Indiana Jones and the Mystery of the Blues.
These shows are, as far as I'm concerned, the best thing on television and has nothing to do with my connection to Indiana Jones. I think he's taken the great popular success of Indiana Jones and turned it around and done something very worthy with it.
In 1992, Harrison Ford was in the middle of shooting a movie called The Fugitive when he received a call from George Lucas. This call was one that Ford thought he might never get again. An invitation to put on the iconic leather hat and jacket of Indiana Jones once again. So as cool as it might have been for Harrison Ford to start appearing regularly on the show, or even just to take over as guest star for an entire episode, that's not really what ended up happening. The truth is that he was just too big of a movie star at the time, and TV still had the stigma of being kind of a lesser form of entertainment. So basically all he was able to do was take over those bookend scenes as a slightly less older Indiana Jones for a single episode. This apparently happened so late in the production process that George Hall's bookend scenes had already been shot by director Carl Schultz. So yeah, these do exist. The alternate version is a kind of silly story about old Indy teaching his grandson Spike all about what quote-unquote real music is.
Grandpa, not another story. Well, I've been listening to you. Now you listen to me.
These scenes were obviously cut when Harrison Ford agreed to guest star, although they were still broadcast in some international versions of the show. Harrison Ford scenes for Indiana Jones and the Mystery of the Blues were shot over the course of just 2 days in December of 1992. Lucas and a small crew traveled to Ford's home in Jackson Hole, Wyoming to film the scenes, which, all told, account for only about 4 minutes total in the 90-minute TV movie.
Harrison did us a favor, and it was a fun little weekend, and it's fun. It's like visiting a friend and making a movie at the same time. Want a cookie?
No. He just reminded me of how much I owe him. No, I'm glad to do it. It's fun. And besides, I live here.
Still, this is definitely Harrison Ford playing Indiana Jones, which is something he hasn't really done all that often in the grand scheme of things. He famously chose not to participate in anything related to the ride at Disneyland, outside of letting his likeness be used for the attraction's Drew Struzan poster. But really, it's only, as far as I know, the 5 movies, this 1 episode of the TV show, and that time that he met Jimmy Buffett.
Captain, understand you could use a little help in here.
No thanks, pal. I've seen the way you fly.
Indy's appearance in Mystery of the Blues is immediately distinct due to Harrison Ford's beard, which was grown for his role in The Fugitive, which he was still in the middle of shooting. Despite only 4 years of real-world time separating the release of The Last Crusade and the airing of this episode, these bookend scenes are actually set in 1950, which is 11 in-universe years later. And I think that was actually done for 2 specific reasons. This is just my own theory, by the way. I don't have any actual evidence for this. But I think one of the reasons was so that they could avoid having to deal with World War II. I mean, think about it. The Last Crusade was released in 1989 in our world, but most of it is set in 1938. If they were to match the real-world passage of time for this TV episode that premiered 4 years later, Harrison Ford's scenes would take place in 1942, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor when the United States officially entered the war. And I think that's probably something that would have been just too hard for the writers to ignore. Like, you'd have to believe that Indy was involved to some extent in the United States' participation in World War II, which we later do get confirmation of.
Don't wave your war record in our face, Colonel Jones. We all served.
No kidding. What side were you on?
He probably wouldn't be messing around in Jackson Hole, Wyoming while that's all going on. Do you know what I mean? But my other theory for why they decided to do a time jump with these scenes is so that they could do a better job of matching Harrison Ford's actual age.
It's not the years, honey. It's the mileage.
And that was something that was apparently starting to become an issue, based on this interview he gave from the set of The Last Crusade.
I may be getting a little too old to do these the way I like to do them. Yeah, I mean, it was 5 years between the last one and this one. If there's 5 years between this one and the next one, I'll be 50 years old. But the time period never changes, so, you know, it's kind of hard to pull that off.
The pilot of the TV series, Young Indiana Jones and the Curse of the Jackal, establishes Indy's birth date as
July the 1st, 1899.
And that makes things actually really clean and simple. For every single year in the 20th century, Indy's age actually matches the last 2 digits of the calendar year, or is one more than it, depending on whether the story is set before or after his birthday. For example, in the first half of 1908, he's 8 years old. In 1920, he's 20. In 1992, he's 92, and so on. In real life, Harrison Ford was 50 years old at the time they shot this episode, so it made sense to set these scenes in 1950. It is kind of a soft retcon, I guess. I mean, we don't know exactly how old the River Phoenix version of Indy is supposed to be in 1912, but to me, he feels like he's a little older than 12 or 13, right? The thing is, the birth year that they established in the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles seems to be the one that they've stuck with in the later 2 movies. It's messy because they don't always use the real world passage of time to mean that the same number of years have passed in the story, like not even a little bit, but Indy is supposed to be about 70 years old in Dial of Destiny, and that movie is clearly set in 1969, so it is pretty close.
It's Moon Day, Mr. Jones.
Anyway, getting back to the Mystery of the Blues, we catch up with a middle-aged Indiana Jones in the middle of a car chase down a snow-covered highway. In the car with him is a new companion, a Native American man named Gray Cloud, who was probably named after a character in The Frisco Kid, which also starred Harrison Ford.
This is not as you said it would be, Dr. Jones.
I got it back to you, didn't I?
Yes, but for how long?
They're being pursued by mysterious villains who are seeking a peace pipe, which is an item that is sacred to Grey Cloud and his people. After evading their pursuers, the two men wander through a snowstorm and eventually find shelter in a cabin where Indy finds a saxophone. The instrument spurs a memory in him, exactly the way these kinds of scenes usually played out with George Hall's older Indy, and he tells Grey Cloud about an adventure he had 30 years earlier.
Reminds me of working my way through the University of Chicago.
You planned that?
No, I was a waiter. But that's an art in itself. You know, you don't start at the top. You work your way up, perfect your style, till you are at the top, like Colosimo's restaurant. The best food, best service, and best jazz in Chicago. I was crazy about jazz.
By the way, the music in this episode was done by a composer named Joel McNeely, who mostly adapted existing John Williams tracks for these bookend scenes.
Good driving!
It's not my first time, you know.
So if I didn't already say it, The Mystery of the Blues is actually a double-length episode, which was probably another marketing stunt, because the truth is it's actually made up of two separate Sean Patrick Flannery stories that are kind of vaguely related to each other. The first half takes place in February of 1920, while Indy is in college at the University of Chicago and working as a waiter. He becomes wrapped up in the lives of real-life musicians like Sidney Bechet and witnesses the role of jazz music in American black culture. The second story takes place 3 months later when Indy's boss is murdered. He and his roommate Elliot Ness, along with Ernest Hemingway, investigate the mystery and eventually find themselves up against Al Capone. These are both fairly standard episodes of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, by which I mean they're kind of good, but honestly I don't think either one is something that you necessarily need to rush out and watch if you've never seen them before. Again, they were written and produced long before the idea of Harrison Ford guest starring was even suggested, and they have absolutely nothing to do with the framing story, outside of a vague connection to jazz music. After Indy finishes telling his story, the villains from the prologue finally show up at the cabin. The confrontation that follows plays out like this.
The pipe belongs to my people. What are we gonna do now?
They've got guns.
They've got the pipe.
Well, things can't always be the way you want them to be. But sometimes they are.
It's very, very weird. Still, Harrison Ford is predictably very good in his brief scenes. That goes without saying. But if nothing else, this episode does have a fun little nod to the pre-existing canon that's worth talking about. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's a throwaway line that establishes that Indy studied at the University of Chicago.
You studied under Professor Ravenwood at the University of Chicago.
Yes, I did.
And that's something that we not only get to actually see in this episode, but was actually the jumping off point for the entire story in the writing process. George Lucas said, "In researching it, we discovered that Al Capone was in Chicago at the time, and that Elliot Ness was going to the University of Chicago at exactly the same time." Those things just pop in and you say, wow, this is great. Look at all the people who were there. Sometimes an episode just happens by accident like that one. Unfortunately, the plan to save the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles with Harrison Ford's guest appearance wasn't quite as successful as the network had hoped. In hopeful anticipation, Lucas and his crew did shoot a second production block of episodes, this time for a total of 15 TV hours worth of material. But the series continued to struggle in the ratings, and it was officially canceled by ABC in June of 1993. Leaving 4 episodes unaired. Eventually, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles was picked up by the Family Channel, which actually commissioned 4 new 90-minute TV movies that were shot and aired between 1994 and 1996. None of these new stories featured bookend scenes with either Harrison Ford or George Hall, but in a nice little bit of symmetry, the final one, which was titled Travels with Father, and also acts as the de facto series finale, also features both Corey Carrier and Sean Patrick Flannery. This time, instead of splitting the film into 2 stories, one for each of them like they did in the pilot, the bulk of the movie focuses on Corey Carrier's younger Indiana Jones, while Sean Patrick Flannery appears in the bookends, himself as the narrator this time. So the final chapter in the behind-the-scenes story of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles is the fact that it doesn't really exist anymore, at least not in its original form. A couple years after the final TV movie aired, George Lucas, sort of apropos of nothing, decided to scramble up and re-edit the entire series into something completely different. From that point onward, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which consisted of 24 regular episodes and 8 TV movies that kind of skipped around to different times in Indy's life, that was turned into The Adventures of Young Indiana Jones, which were 22 TV movies presented in strictly chronological order. At first glance, you might think that all George did was stick 2 thematically or chronologically connected episodes together and give them a new title. For example, the episode where Indy travels to Barcelona and the episode where he meets Franz Kafka were combined together to create a new movie called Espionage Escapades. Or the one where Puccini falls in love with Indy's mom is combined with the one where he falls in love with the daughter of Archduke Ferdinand, and that became a movie called The Perils of Cupid. However, the truth was that there was actually a lot more to it than just re-editing the stuff that they had already shot. Again, the show had already been canceled by this point. I mean, it was done. But for some reason, they decided to go out and actually shoot new footage for these new cuts. A lot of what they shot for these new Adventures of Young Indiana Jones movies was bridge material. So like shots and scenes that would help smooth over the transitions between what were originally 2 completely different episodes. Like some of the stuff on the train in the middle of the movie Demons of Deception, which was shot to get Indy from an episode in Verdun to a different one in Paris. They actually even shot 2 entirely new 45-minute segments, one starring each young Indy actor, just for these new movies. The Corey Carrier one is especially funny because the young actor had just aged so much between the stuff they had originally shot in the early 90s and this new footage that was being shot in the late 90s. Also, here's some fun trivia. This scene, which was another one of those scenes that helps kind of bridge a gap between episodes, this was actually shot in Tunisia during principal photography for The Phantom Menace, using a lot of the same crew. And I don't know, I just think that's kind of interesting. In some cases, the existing material was extended with deleted scenes, as was the case with Winds of Change. And there was even substantial footage from a completely different movie altogether in Daredevils of the Desert that helps pad out the runtime. As for the things that were removed, well, one of them was the title sequence and theme song, which is kind of a shame because I think it's really catchy actually. But by far the biggest loss was the removal of all of these bookend scenes with old Indy in New York City. These are all completely gone from any modern version of the show, going all the way back to the VHS releases. And that's pretty unforgivable if you ask me, because as corny as those scenes were sometimes, there was such an undeniable charm to George Hall's performance. It's really a shame that they've all been cut out, even if they did at times portray him less like Indiana Jones and more like Grandpa Simpson.
One trick is to tell them stories that don't go anywhere.
Obviously, Harrison Ford scenes were not cut, which means that The Mystery of the Blues is the only episode that got to keep that format of an older version of the character narrating his adventures from his younger days. Pretty much the only difference to that episode, which was already double length, is a couple changes to the opening credits to make them a little bit more in line with all of the other ones. And even though that quick Harrison Ford cameo is kind of the only thing that people remember about the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, the show itself actually had more of an impact on the direction of the franchise than you might realize. For one thing, it got everyone excited about the franchise again. Seeing Harrison Ford step back into his iconic role, even in this brief and underwhelming way, started the wheels turning in Lucas's head about bringing the character back to the big screen for real. He began developing the script for a new movie immediately after production of The Mystery of the Blues. The deal that he and Steven Spielberg made with Paramount all the way back in the 70s had included the rights to produce Raiders of the Lost Ark and potentially 4 total sequels. So they still had some work to do, you know? And with the fact that he had kind of already broken the seal when it came to the series' pre-World War II time period, George was able to return to his original intention for the franchise to play fast and loose with genre for each film. He brought on board Jeb Stuart, screenwriter for the original Die Hard and not so coincidentally The Fugitive, to work on a draft for a brand new theatrical film. And by February of 1995, Stuart had completed multiple drafts on a screenplay titled Indiana Jones and the Saucer Men from Mars.
Saucer Men from Mars.
In the same way that the original trilogy, set in the 1930s, paid homage to the pulpy adventure serials that were popular at that time, the intention with this new concept was to do the same thing with the 1950s equivalent.
It was the idea of taking the genre from the 1930s serials, action-adventure serials, to the B science fiction movies of the 50s, in the early 50s. And I said, if we move the whole thing into the 50s, which would be age-appropriate for Harrison, that would be the cinematic equivalent. And I wanted to rest it on a cinematic antecedent, like we did with the other one.
I think it's also hard to ignore the influence of things like The X-Files and the renewed public obsession with UFOs in the 1990s when this script was written. Interestingly, Stuart's script for Indy 4 actually opens in 1949, which would make it technically a prequel to The Mystery of the Blues, which was again set the following year. A lot of elements in what would eventually become Kingdom of the Crystal Skull actually got their origins here, including things like the flesh-eating ants, a journey over an impossibly high waterfall, a fight on a rocket sled, and even Indy's adventures in Nuketown, including the infamous lead-lined fridge. The script also acknowledges the death of Marcus Brody early on, due to the passing of actor Denham Elliott in 1992. It's actually super interesting to see how much of the story is the same between this screenplay and the movie that was eventually made 13 years later. Reading through it, I noticed several scenes from Kingdom of the Crystal Skull that feel directly lifted from this early draft, just sometimes with different characters or in a different context. But honestly, what's even more interesting about this script are the places where it's different from the final film. Indy meets a doctor of linguistics named Elaine McGregor in the prologue and proposes to her early in the film. There's a scene at their wedding with characters like Marion Ravenwood, Willie Scott, Sala, and Henry Sr., who are all in total bemusement of the idea that a serial bachelor like Indiana Jones would ever settle down with anyone. However, Indy is then mysteriously left at the altar when Elaine is kidnapped right before the ceremony. This script's climax is also much more overtly science fiction than even Crystal Skull, with spidery aliens stalking the characters through a small town and then full-on battling with soldiers from their saucer. Ultimately, and somewhat predictably, the humans' fight with the aliens is actually little more than a misunderstanding, with Indy and Elaine trying to convince the evil Russians that they mean them no harm. It's not exactly as sappy as knowledge was their treasure, but it is along those same lines. And the whole thing ends with Indy and Elaine's second try at a wedding that this time goes off without a hitch. Jeffrey Boehm, who had written The Last Crusade, did some rewrites on Stuart's script in 1995, but it didn't matter. Spielberg shot down the story's premise altogether, saying that it was too similar to the blockbuster Independence Day. Although I think a lot of people have started to suspect that he was never really as excited about aliens as a plot device as George Lucas was, and kind of just used that as an excuse. And that seemed to put a stop on the idea of a new Indiana Jones movie for several years. Using a lot of the technical advancements in filmmaking that the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles had pioneered, George Lucas was able to jump headfirst back into Star Wars, producing the special editions of his original trilogy and eventually the prequel trilogy. Steven Spielberg, in turn, directed a financially successful sequel to Jurassic Park in 1997, and the following year released one of the most ambitious and powerful films of his career. But the idea of another Indiana Jones movie never truly left their minds.
But I just remember people asking me, when are you making the next Indiana Jones? Harrison was the person that took it seriously. And he finally called me and said, why don't we make one of these pictures? There's a fan base out there that wants it.
Spielberg and Lucas reconvened just a couple of months later to discuss a new version of the fourth movie, now subtitled either The Lost City of the Gods or Phantom City of the Gods. However, they didn't really get anywhere with that, and by 2002, Lucas suggested that they could use a new creative voice on the project. And as fate would have it, he suggested someone that he had met and worked with on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. See, it really is all connected. This new writer was Frank Darabont, who had written 6 episodes of the series, and who, in the years since the show had ended, had become an acclaimed director in his own right. Darabont's first draft of Indy 4 introduced Indy and Marion's 13-year-old daughter, a completely different character, apparently, than the daughter who had appeared in the TV show. Spielberg objected to this character, however, because he thought the dynamic would be too similar to the character of Kelly, who was the daughter of Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park 2. The villains in Frank Darabont's version of the script were ex-Nazis, hiding in South America, but Spielberg also vetoed that as a plot device, as he has since declared, after making the Oscar-winning Schindler's List, that he just doesn't feel comfortable using Nazis as cartoony villains anymore, which makes a lot of sense. And by the way, that's also my secret theory for why he dropped out of directing Dial of Destiny. Instead, they returned to Soviet agents, who had also been the antagonists of the Saucer Men from Mars draft. The reworking of that plot finally gave George Lucas the opportunity to include a supernatural artifact that he had been fascinated by for more than a decade. As part of that mass generation of ideas for the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, Lucas had watched a documentary about the Crystal Skull of Lubonton. I have no idea if I'm saying that correctly. But that was a mystical Mesoamerican artifact purported to have been discovered in 1924 by Anna Mitchell Hedges.
The Ox and I were obsessed with the Mitchell Hedges skull in college.
The skull was made from a single block of quartz and apparently showed no evidence of tool marks. That skull has actually at this point been pretty much proven to be a fake.
This is not the Mitchell Hedges skull.
But a similar artifact with supernatural powers was originally planned to be the centerpiece of a 3rd season episode of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles if it hadn't been canceled. This story was going to take place in Honduras in December of 1920 and actually would have introduced a young version of Renee Belloc from Raiders of the Lost Ark. In this unproduced episode, we'd actually get to see the two men meet for the first time and see that they started out as friends. They were going to go on an adventure into the ruins of an ancient Mayan city where they would encounter the Crystal Skull. However, Belloc would then steal the skull from Indy and sell it to an adventurer named Mitchell Hedges, which would begin their long-running rivalry that continues in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It seems clear that if the show had kept going, George and the writers were going to put a greater emphasis on tying back to the pre-existing canon of the franchise. Again, there were already hints of that in exploring Indy's experiences at the University of Chicago, spun off from a single throwaway line in Raiders. In fact, the Honduras adventure from that unproduced Crystal Skull script was actually intended to be the very same one that's referenced during the banquet scene in Temple of Doom.
I seem to remember that in Honduras you were accused of being a grave robber rather than an archaeologist.
There was also eventually going to be an episode that would show Indy meeting Abner Ravenwood, his former mentor and Marion's father. And then there were those Family Channel movies, which were largely based on unused 3rd season storylines and scripts. In one of them, Indy sets off on an international journey to find a diamond called the Peacock's Eye. And although they never actually bring too much attention to it in the show itself, that's actually supposed to be the same diamond that he finally gets his hands on during the opening scene of Temple of Doom.
The diamond, Lau. The deal was for the diamond.
Which kind of makes that Peacock's Eye movie a prequel to a prequel. But unfortunately, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles was canceled with more than 30 scripts fully written that were never produced. And that meant, among other things, that George Lucas's borderline obsession with crystal skulls had no viable outlet. But if you pay attention to some of the expanded universe Indiana Jones material from around that time, you'll notice that they actually pop up quite a bit. They're mentioned in several of the Indiana Jones novels, including some written by both Marty Caidin and Max McCoy. When California's Disneyland attraction was cloned to the new Disney Sea Park in Tokyo in 2001, it was renamed and slightly rethemed to actually highlight a version of the Crystal Skull. And in 2003, Crystal Skulls finally made their way into a screenplay for an actual Indiana Jones movie. The third draft of Frank Darabont's script, which was subtitled City of the Gods, is even more similar to the eventual fourth film than Saucermen from Mars was. It introduces characters like Harold Oxley and brings back Marion for a more significant role. At this point, there's still no Mutt Williams to be found, but aside from a few other minor differences, like Marion's flamboyant husband Peter, an alien projection of Adolf Hitler, and a drunk Henry Jones Sr. singing Frank Sinatra, it is very close to what eventually ended up on screen. Unfortunately, Frank Darabont was pretty unceremoniously dismissed from the project shortly after.
Basically, what it really boils down to is I worked with Steven Spielberg, who I revere. What a gentleman, what a great man he is. Worked with him to provide some material on Indiana Jones. I wrote a couple of drafts for him. He really dug it. George didn't.
Darabont was replaced by David Koepp, who's the one who eventually got official credit for the screenplay. However, Darabont was very outspoken in expressing his dissatisfaction with this decision, and even implied that he should have been given more credit for the final project.
The title of the Crystal Skull, was that something you were kind of...
I had Crystal Skulls in mind, yeah, absolutely.
A lot of people think that after the mixed reaction to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, he actually leaked his own script online to the public, which is how we're able to see just how similar and different it is from the final movie. But anyway, there's actually even more influence from the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles on Crystal Skull than just its artifact and one of its early writers. There's actually even a line of dialogue in the movie that specifically references something from the show.
Where'd you learn that one?
Long story.
I got time.
I rode with Pancho Villa. A couple of his guys spoke it.
Bullshit.
You asked.
Yeah, this line is not just throwaway small talk. It does directly refer to the events shown in the pilot episode of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles.
Pancho Villa.
Technically, I was kidnapped.
By Pancho Villa.
It was a fight against Victoriano Huerta.
And then there's the Dial of Destiny. So by the time they finally got around to making this fifth and final movie, it had been a really long time since the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles had been on the air. So are there any Easter eggs or connections to this often overlooked chapter in the franchise's history? Well, no. Not really. I mean, there's a quick nod to Indy's time in Chicago, but again, that's something that actually came from Raiders originally. Actually, the small amount of shared DNA that there is between the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles and the Dial of Destiny is in its spirit, I think. Even though it's not really the same thing at all, I do think that there's something in common with the climax of the movie, in which Indiana Jones, a man defined by his passion for the past, finds himself once again face to face with a figure straight from the pages of a history book.
Hopefully, younger people will become more fascinated with history and become more interested in history and realize that history is really about people more than it's about events. And the people are just like we are, and begin to really understand the fascination of history, the history of the human race, the history of people, the history of culture, the history of politics, not necessarily the history of events in a chronological order.
But the biggest connection, and the one that I like the most, is the fact that regardless of continuity, Indiana Jones does apparently always settle down in New York City in his old age. I guess I can imagine him sticking around for another 20 years, losing his wife and an eyeball at some point, and growing into the kind of old guy who would drop a hamburger in a mailbox.
Doesn't even have correct postage.
That's it. I mean, people don't really talk about that Young Indiana Jones show very much, and I just think that's kind of weird. But in looking at it closer for this video, I realized that that's probably just because it's not really that good or that bad. So, sorry, I don't really have a big revelation at the end of the video here. Have a nice day.
You make me sit through this whole long story and there's no point?
Sorry it takes me so long to make videos. I'm trying.
I am a great lover of